doing at the Isamu Noguchi Catalogue Raisonné project. For those of you using the closed captioning option, I'm going to leave this up for a few minutes. I know this is the time of year when a lot of us, especially after such a very, very difficult year, and especially after such a difficult winter, in the Eastern Seaboard, it's been pretty tough. Many of us start dreaming about going somewhere warm and sunny. So today we'll, in spirit, be going to Mexico City through Los Angeles. We obviously really look forward to your questions. Please feel free to use the Zoom chat function. We'll be returning to those questions at the end of the presentation. We'll keep things fairly informally. We can unmute and talk then. If you don't have any questions but have seen the mural in person, I'd be very interested to hear about your experience with that. Now, a little bit of general information about who we are for those of you who aren't familiar with our work. The Catalogue Raisonné is the authoritative listing of the artistic practice of Isamu Noguchi. To give a sense of our present scope of work, there's about 3,000 objects under consideration by the CR. We've completed and published the research on about 1,200 to 1,300 objects and have another maybe 1,000 under active and ongoing research. Even given that his career spans 6 decades, Noguchi is an amazingly productive artist, and there are maybe an additional 6,000 works on paper which were not part of the present scope of work, though we are hoping to include them in a later phase, and I'm actively cataloging those pieces as they come up. Today's presentation is the second in a series we've been hosting around the research at the CR into Noguchi's designs for public art projects during the 1930s. Now, Isamu Noguchi is, of course, today recognized as having created some of the most important and really thoughtful and evocative public spaces of the 20th century. And looking at some of these early works from the 1930s, most of which were not realized or only realized much later in his career in some changed form, that can be really interesting in what it tells us both about Noguchi and about his times. So in terms of Noguchi's early professional career creating public art, we tend to look at his iconic News of 1940 as this is a monumental plaque in stainless steel, of course, that he made for the Associated Press building at Rockefeller Center here in New York City. We tend to think of this work as the turning point, and certainly that's true in terms of News being an enormously important commission, and that winning this, what was in 1939, a very high profile commission, did, yes, establish his national reputation as an artist. But history of Mexico is every bit as monumental and important an artwork, and it was actually sculpted 4 years earlier. And in fact, is even 2 years earlier than Picasso's famous Guernica, also an anti-war work of art. Now, History of Mexico is in fact Noguchi's first realized artwork designed specifically for a public space. In terms of DNA sequencing, Noguchi himself would later describe News as a hangover from the earlier mural he created in Mexico. To give a sense of the scale here, it's just under 8 feet high and extends almost 72 feet over 3 walls. These walls sit at slight angles to each other. It's about 20 inches deep, and in certain places extends almost 10 inches proud of the surface of the wall. All this, of course, in hand sculpted concrete and pigmented cement. The reputation of this, in person, it's a real tour de force in sculpture, in sculptural relief, has tended to struggle in part because of its remote location. It's in downtown Mexico City in the second floor stairwell landing of the Mercado Abelardo Rodríguez. Now, the market is an active public building located just inside the outer edge of the city's historic center. And I like this picture to just show how many of the murals in the building live cheek to jowl with the activities of the market. Now, History Mexico is one of many works of art in the Mercado building. In fact, some 1,450 square meters of the interior walls and ceilings of the building are decorated with murals. And even so, the market building does not see the volume of art tourism that many of the other buildings, even a couple blocks away in Mexico City, that they see. So for better or for worse, History of Mexico is not on the radar of many tourists, even tourists that are familiar with Noguchi's work. Now, in terms of the critical understanding and appreciation of History of Mexico, until fairly recently, scholarship around Noguchi's artistic practice has tended to mention his mural in Mexico almost in passing. Most biographies of Noguchi or summations of his work tend to give History of Mexico a few pages at the most, and then mainly as a backdrop to discussing his relationship with the remarkable and glamorous Frida Kahlo. In 1978, art historian Sam Hunter, even writing about Noguchi and History of Mexico, tends to dismiss Noguchi's mural for what he calls, quote, its dated character and naive social idealism. And in his own 1967 autobiography, A Sculpture's World, Noguchi himself tended to remember the composition almost as a list of cliches. Noguchi writes, at one end was the fat capitalist being murdered by a skeleton, shades of Posada. There were war, crimes of the church, and labor triumphant. Yet the future looked out brightly in the figure of an Indian boy observing Einstein's equation for energy. Now, generally, when speaking about the mural later in his career, Noguchi emphasized the experience of working in Mexico in 1935 as almost being more important than the artwork that resulted from it. He wrote, quote, but what was important for me in the making was the making. The help of Lazaro, who mixed the cement, Sanchez Fogarty of the Tolteca Cement Company, who gave me the cement, above all, the affection that surrounded me, the life of Mexico, the songs of my love. Diego chased me twice with a gun, but fortunately did not shoot. Now, it's likely that the perspective of some of these authors, including Noguchi, was shaded by the sensitivities around the politics and propaganda of the Cold War after 1947. And Noguchi actually plays into that accidentally or on purpose. Upon returning to New York from Mexico City in 1936, Noguchi identifies History of Mexico with the hopes and aspirations of the left. In an article discussing History of Mexico in this leftist publication, New Masses, he explained his view that, quote, capitalism everywhere struggles with inevitable death. All the machinery of war, coercion, and bigotry are as smoke from the fire. Labor awakens with the red flag, and youth, through education, will see the world creatively more abundant with equal opportunity for all. Now, this quote is, as well as that one particular photo of Noguchi standing, very proudly beside the red fist in the composition, which that photo is ostensibly just to give readers a sense of the scale of the larger mural. All of these factors would tend to prejudice some audiences against the mural and to create for some lasting misunderstandings about the artist's personal politics. History of Mexico obviously clearly belongs very much to a certain moment in 1935. It's the depths of the Depression, when the stability of the capitalist system was being openly questioned in the media, the increasing influence of the labor movement, all against the backdrop of growing tensions in Europe. But also key, of course, is Noguchi's personal interpretation of the subject matter, which he later admitted was fueled in this moment in 1935 by his own frustrations in trying to establish his artistic practice, and in particular, his frustrations at not being able to realize his public plans, his plans for useful public art projects. So now, at least as early as the 1990s, which is not coincidentally, I think, towards the end of the Cold War, there's a renewed general interest among researchers and scholars in the work of Mexican muralists. And Noguchi's History of Mexico, or History Mexico, also entered a period of some reconsideration, which is still going on. Most recently, of course, the Whitney Museum of American Art included images of History Mexico in the exhibition and catalog for Vida Americana, Mexican Muralists, Remake American Art, 1925 to 1945. One last practical issue around the reputation and understanding of this mural, of course. It's probably worth mentioning that historically, the quality of the photography that was available tended to be pretty poor. In an example like this, a site-specific work like History Mexico, because of its remote location, there's a lot of extra pressure on the photography to make it possible for viewers to understand and appreciate the work, viewers that haven't been able to visit it in person. Now, it's admittedly a very difficult work to photograph. The mural is pretty narrow relative to being so very wide. It extends over 3 walls. The slight angles of each of these walls throws the light and makes it difficult to get it all in one shot. The proportions of the room, it's basically a compressed hexagon with 2 major columns right in the middle. Also, each of these walls are pierced by a very bright window. So you're photographing right into the light, and it makes it almost impossible to see the rest of the mural. Now, commissioning high quality photography for Noguchi's artwork is, of course, one of the major priorities of the cataloging and research work we do at the CR. In 2018, we organized a trip to Mexico City, which also became an opportunity for a more official visit by the museum. We met with the authorities in Mexico City Historic District, who are responsible for maintaining the city's many wonderful art treasures. They are clearly aware of how important and significant Noguchi's mural is and value it enormously. But the building is in active use. History Mexico is in pretty good shape, but even last fall there was fire there. There's active cooking on the ground floor. History Mexico was not damaged, but of course it is in a public space under a flat roof with what appears to be the original 1934 windows. Just to give you a sense of what's happening with some of the other murals, there was leaks that have apparently been repaired, but you know, it's a working, thriving, changing building. We know that the mural was restored at least once in the 1980s. Noguchi visited at some point in the process, seen here. Note that the tiled part of the wall in this next photo, the tiled wall and the floor are not painted bright red. At some point since 1982, somebody has sort of covered up any kind of water damage there with red paint. So we hired an architectural photographer, including setup. His name is Rafael Gamo, by the way, wonderful photographer, including setup. It took about 3 days to manage the logistics around the light and shadows from the windows, but also to try and capture the way the mural interacts with the public space, which is of course really important. We know that the configuration of the walls is otherwise exactly as it was in 1935. And we know that Noguchi would have considered how the viewer moved through the room and experienced the mural. So that's how we ended up in Mexico City in August of 2018. And I'm going to now talk to why and how Isamu Noguchi is in Mexico City in 1935, working in a relatively obscure public market, and how he ends up sculpting what is a really massive high relief mural in concrete and colored cement. It's really a work of shock and awe. So in an earlier presentation, I discussed one of the most important exhibitions of Noguchi's work during the 1930s, and the last one that he would actually hold for over a decade, which was held at Marie Harriman Gallery in January and February of 1935. Now, while this exhibition includes some of Noguchi's most significant works to that date, several, of course, on the left of your screen, being some hugely ambitious proposals for public art projects. Some of his earliest some of his earliest that we know of. This exhibition was ultimately a financial and critical disappointment for Noguchi. I hope nobody's being disturbed. I just realized we've got noise going on right behind me. Please, anybody let me know if the sound is in any way disruptive. So one work that Marie Harriman declined to exhibit was the original version of Birth as seen here. And in the next slide, we have Birth as it is now on the right of the screen. This is in the museum's collection. Noguchi obviously made significant changes to the work. He'd apparently witnessed a live birth at Bellevue Hospital, and Harriman seemed to feel the resulting sculpture was a little much for her audience. Noguchi actually later mentions that Birth in its original form was in fact a deliberate effort to provoke polite society. And so we already have this indication that is of his growing frustrations with the traditional norms of the New York art world. Now, Harriman's decision about Birth, of course, is surprising because she did exhibit Death, a lynched figure. This is, for obvious reasons, a very controversial work of art. It was from the moment it was exhibited. And another indication in Noguchi's work of a shift towards themes of social activism. It's interesting, of course, we've recently discovered that George Gershwin actually seriously considered buying it. He actually put deposit down. There's records in his archives of him doing that. Either Noguchi or Gershwin changed their mind. We don't know who. The work is, of course, now in the museum's collection. Gershwin did buy or had recently acquired at the Harriman Show, Black Boy of 1934, a work in ebony. Now, this sculpture was lost after the Harriman Show. There were no photos. We only had the title and the material and a note that George Gershwin was the original owner. And in the course of trying to locate the famous Gershwin portrait bust, we stumbled across this piece still in the family's collection. So this is a fairly new research, and images of Black Boy would not have been available to researchers writing on History Mexico. Now, I've created a short bibliography. If anyone has any particular interest, I'm happy to email it to them. But also, if you're lucky enough to see History of Mexico in person, I wanted to especially recommend this particular, it's a short article from 2001. There's been a fair amount of new research since he wrote this, but he does cover the mural in amazing detail and from many, many different angles. History of Mexico is really a very complex work, and there are so many different ways to approach an understanding of this work. This afternoon, I'm only going to be able to scrape the surface of a few of them. My main aim today is to set History of Mexico in the context of what we know so far about Noguchi's artistic practice at this particular moment in his career, which is why I've, of course, mentioned those last three works, Birth, Death, and Black Boy, because they do appear again in different forms in the composition for History of Mexico, which we know he's working on less than a year after the Harriman Show closes. Just give me 1 minute. I'm so sorry about this. Just give me half an hour. Thanks so much. Sorry about that. Oh, again, everyone, so sorry about that. So now, in fact, we have very little information. We were talking about after the Harriman exhibition. We have very little information about Noguchi's movements after the close of the Harriman Show in mid-February 1935. Much of what we have is somewhat anecdotal and vague, including from Noguchi himself. What we have is a growing number of recently discovered artworks and projects that he worked on in 1935, and they suggest a sort of trail of breadcrumbs leading to the eventual sculpting of History of Mexico. Now, again, from Noguchi's autobiography of 67, we have some sense of his state of mind and motivations during the year. We know that he tries several times unsuccessfully to get the support of the WPA in order to realize any one of his many designs and proposals for public projects. We actually now know, of course, that the politics and economics about of sponsorship of the WPA, especially in the mid-1930s, actually seems to have very little relation to artistic merit. But Noguchi took this rejection and his disappointment around the Harriman exhibition very much to heart, and became quite disaffected generally with the New York art scene. He writes, "In despair, I took off for Hollywood and there made some hits for money with which to make an exploratory trip to Mexico." Now, of course, for many reasons, Mexico at this particular moment would have been an ideal destination for Noguchi or any artist that was interested in making socially relevant public art. Mexican art and Mexican artists were very much in the American news during this time. The three leading exponents of Mexican muralism, known as Los Tres Grandes, consisting of Diego Rivera on the right, David Alfaro Siqueiros in the middle, and Jose Clemente Orozco on the far left. They were all working in the US during the 1930s. They were creating amazingly famous, provocative, public, political, and social themed murals for institutional spaces on both coasts of the country. We know that Noguchi had met at least two of Los Tres Grandes in the early 1930s. He mentions meeting Siqueiros particularly at the Hotel des Artistes in New York City. Interestingly, Siqueiros had already begun advocating for the use of modern materials as essential in the making of truly modern art. And this would have, of course, resonated enormously with Noguchi, who is already interested in making portrait busts in such sort of non-traditional materials as copper, aluminum, and iron already. The materials of the modern industrial age. And further, of course, Siqueiros' ideas might also have inspired, or at least justified aesthetically, Noguchi's eventual use of concrete and cement when he was sculpting History of Mexico. We also know that Noguchi had met Orozco. Obviously, he sculpted his portrait in 1931 when Orozco was in New York working on a cycle of 5 large murals for the New School of Social Research. If you get a chance, they're really, really worth the visit to the New School on the lower side there. Between 1932 and 1934, Orozco would create, of course, the Epic of American Civilization. And this is a cycle of 23 murals for the Baker Library at Dartmouth University. Interestingly, of course, Nelson Rockefeller was then a student of Dartmouth, and he convinced his mother to underwrite the commission. Initially, the members of the Dartmouth faculty had approached Diego Rivera to teach fresco painting at Dartmouth, but he declined because he was then working on the murals for 30 Rockefeller, which of course famously would be removed when Rivera declined to paint over an image of Lenin that he'd incorporated into the composition. But for Noguchi at this particular moment in 1935, when he's so especially disaffected with the galleries and with critics and with the policies of the WPA and with the economic disparity that he was witnessing personally during the Depression, many of the aims and ideals of Mexican muralist art, most especially the sense of rebellion, these must have been very appealing. And Noguchi would also have been aware of any number of fellow American artists who were then traveling in Mexico to work on murals under Rivera. This included Marion Greenwood, who Noguchi had met in Paris in 1928. Just a beautiful photo of the two of them. In 1964, Greenwood is actually interviewed by the Archives of American Art. It's a wonderful resource. And she mentions that she'd begun visiting Mexico as early as 1932, also drawn by the work of Los Tres Grandes. And Pablo O'Higgins, who was another American artist, was down there already. He'd been trained under Rivera, and he trained her on the art of fresco painting, and she became rather well known in Mexico for her mural works. By early 1935, she had been invited back to Mexico along with her sister Grace, also an artist, to begin working at the Mercado Rodríguez, painting the walls and ceilings of the stairwells and the upstairs vestibule, where history, the stairwell that leads up to the vestibule, where History of Mexico would eventually be installed. And we have this wonderful picture of her, and I believe this is her at work in the Mercado Rodríguez. Now, it seems probable that Noguchi would have had Greenwood's firsthand accounts about, opportunities for artists in Mexico pretty early on in 1935, but even so, he doesn't leave immediately for Mexico after the close of the Harriman exhibition, and we have some, minimum 4, maximum 8 months where he's in the US producing artworks on both coasts. And I'm going to mention 3 in particular because they're interesting in the lead up to the Mercado Rodríguez. So in our archives, we have a rough draft. It's now been digitized, and it's available to anybody who wants to source it through our digital platform on the website. We have an unpublished manuscript that Noguchi, we know, was working on in the 1970s, focusing mostly on his early career. This manuscript is almost a sort of stream of consciousness of memories. It's beautifully written, but it's just an incredibly rich resource of very specific memories. Speaking about this period in 1935, Noguchi recalls leaving New York for Hollywood, what he called that glittering mirage, in order to do portraits for the purpose of financing a trip to Mexico. Now, in Los Angeles, Noguchi comes to an agreement with gallerist Earl Stendhal to take on portrait commissions, working in a tent on the patio behind Stendhal's gallery. Now, I've been working with Stendhal's biographer, and I know I'm planning to visit his archives in DC. There's probably a lot more information here about this particular relationship and contract. There's a list of Hollywood movie stars that we know Noguchi did portraits of. We know some of them. There might be more. I know Joan Crawford was actually one of the possible portraits that didn't happen, but we'll go to the archives and hope for the best. Now, I mention all this because one of the most interesting projects that comes out of this particular moment in Hollywood is Noguchi's design for the house that Richard Neutra was designing for the director Joseph von Sternberg. We're not really clear how this commission comes to be, but it's likely that Stendhal actually knew Neutra and connected Noguchi to the von Sternberg project. I love this. These are wonderful photos. We're very lucky to have them. Now, like so many of Noguchi's early designs around recreation and play, the pool project was not realized, unfortunately, and it's not clear why. But Neutra later recalled that von Sternberg had asked specifically that there be no locks on the bathroom doors, because at Hollywood parties, people were always attempting suicides in bathrooms. Now, given that comment, maybe it's not surprising that the finished house doesn't seem to have had a pool, or a deep pool anyway. Now, von Sternberg actually sells the house only a few years later. Anne Rand actually eventually buys it, lives there for some time. The house was torn down in '71 for the land. An apartment block is put up in its place. So it's just interesting to think that even if the pool had been realized, it probably wouldn't have survived. Now, according to Noguchi, at some point during this visit to Hollywood, California, he makes an exploratory trip by train to Mexico City. And it's during this first exploratory trip, I guess we're guessing, we really don't know for sure, but we're guessing it would be in the spring of 1935, that Noguchi becomes more officially involved in the decoration of the Mercado Rodríguez. The Greenwood sisters offer him part of their allotment of wall space in the upstairs vestibule. They and the 8 other artists that are at work on mural decorations throughout the building were already, one would assume, about 8 to 10 months into their own projects. And at this point, the Greenwood sisters had realized that they were not going to be able to complete the mural decorations on all their share of the wall space. So they offer Noguchi 3 walls. Now, Diego Rivera is acting sort of semi-formally as the art director of the project. Noguchi remembers submitting some early sketches and designs to Rivera for his consideration. Quote, Diego Rivera was not adverse. Unknown to him, I had fallen in love with his wife, Frida. That's why this particular manuscript is such a delight. It's just filled with these kind of things. Now, there are different stories about exactly how Noguchi would have met Kahlo and this whole circle of Mexican artists. Now, he either met Kahlo at an event at the Guggenheim back in New York City, or possibly during this first visit to Mexico City. Noguchi was already friendly with famed artist Miguel Covarrubias, who's on the far right. He's a wonderful caricaturist, amongst other things. He's a very important guy, but a lot of early Vanity Fair designs, caricatures are by him. So Covarrubias, of course, is also the husband of artist Rosa Rolando, who was a lifelong friend of Frida Kahlo. In 1935, Covarrubias and Rolando had just returned to live permanently in Mexico City. And just by way of context, Mexico City is something of a hub at this moment, with international artists coming to Mexico to escape the tensions in Europe. Members of the Bauhaus are working in Mexico. Joseph Albers is visiting Mexico and is discovering Aztec and Mayan art, which will be, of course, hugely important to him later on. There's also a large community of expatriates from the US working in all sorts of various circles, political and economic. So very much the kind of cosmopolitan atmosphere that Noguchi is particularly comfortable in, especially during these early decades of his career. And we know that by the end of this first visit, Noguchi decides to return to New York City only long enough to find sufficient funds, apparently, to return to Mexico City for an extended period. So back in New York City, he submits, and this is a new discovery, this is one of several competitions that we know Noguchi enters during this period for public art projects. And they're open competitions for American artists. Now, his model is the second from the left. It's the figure of justice. It stands out a mile, of course. It's a male figure. It's a nude male figure. And I draw your attention to what we assume he's holding. Instead of a sword, he's holding a dagger, and over his face, what he's blinded by is, of course, a book, probably the Bible. Now, the timing of this competition, when Noguchi might have submitted his model, and we're still researching this, suggests that he's still in New York City through much of the summer of 1935. And remember, the assumption has generally been that Noguchi is already in Mexico City working on History of Mexico by June of 1935. And I should mention again that we will see this symbol, whatever it means, of a Bible over a human face in the imagery of History of Mexico. Now, Noguchi secures a loan from the Guggenheim Foundation while he's in New York for $600, expressly for the purposes of returning to Mexico. But still in New York City, Noguchi says he also approached the WPA again, offering not to leave for Mexico if they would agree to fund a proposal he had for what he describes as, quote, a sculpture to be seen from the air on the large triangular lot of the road intersection in front of Newark Air Terminal. Now, yet another unrealized project, public art project. Now we have three really: von Sternberg's Pool, Justice, the figure of justice, and the proposal for Newark Airport. And all of these seem to suggest that any arrangements to work on the walls at the Mercado in Mexico City were, at least in Noguchi's mind, written in pencil. And I think it's something to keep in mind when we're considering what an amazing, this amazing artwork, History of Mexico, but for any of these other projects, it might not have happened. Noguchi designs and sculpts History of Mexico after a long series of disappointments and during a period of great frustration in his professional life, and that any of these projects have had the green light, we wouldn't have the work we have in Mexico City. So while we don't have a reliable date for Noguchi's return trip to Mexico City, I think the earliest he could have left New York was probably the early autumn of 1935. And I say this because, strangely, we do have a lot of details about when he left Mexico, which is in July. So counting back, he says it took 8 months. So that would put us sort of, October, November at the earliest that he's, or at the latest, I should say, that he's back in Mexico City. Now, about the trip to Mexico, strangely, we do have a lot of details. Not the date, but he tells us that he borrowed Buckminster Fuller's big Hudson sports car. He's got a little bit of a description, a very poetic description of the route he takes, including several near very serious car accidents en route. And we believe that he seems to have driven directly to Mexico City. He even mentions going through Texarkana. So as I say, we actually have the actual date that he leaves Mexico. That's through and the port. He actually leaves through Veracruz. We know the name of the boat, and he leaves on July 1st, 1936, and he's back in New York on July 7th, 1936. So again, that puts us, if it's 8 months, the earliest he could start is October, November of 1935, and that's important, because by that point, most of the other artists working on the Mercado walls are nearing completion of their artworks. Now, Covarrubias and Rivera convinced the various governmental authorities that are managing the expenses of the building's decoration to allow Noguchi into the project, and that's agreed only on the condition that Noguchi will work for the same wage as the fresco painters. And now Greenwood, Marion Greenwood remembers this as being 13 or 14 pesos per square meter. She describes actually feeling relatively rich because of the actual cost of living at that time in Mexico City. But she also remembered that, and this is important, that the artist stood in the same line on payday as the other manual laborers, and that this was an important part of the larger experience for her and for Noguchi, this sense of working side by side for a common purpose with the artists and with the laborers, and that the artists were thereby contributing to a brave new world of equality and mutual respect. Here are the other artists at work on the mural walls. And that would be Greenwood. I assume that that's Grace. I haven't, her sister Grace sitting beside her, but Greenwood is on her, to the far left. So the market building itself had been newly built and completed in 1934. It's built in the colonial style to suit the surrounding buildings. Keep in mind that there had been a huge migration of workers from the countryside into Mexico City in the decades following the revolution. And this new covered market building replaced the haphazard maze of stalls in the open streets where garbage and general hygiene disease was becoming a huge issue. The Mercado building was in fact a symbol of the social and economic reforms of the then administration, the Rodríguez administration, which was in power between 32 and 34. Originally, the mural scheme was intended to emphasize scenes of hygiene and nutrition. This is a beautiful older photo. But in 1934, under the new regime of Lazaros Cardenas, the emphasis of the subject matter of the murals shifted from depicting the social benefits brought about by the revolution to instead depicting the reasons for the revolution. So in 1964, again, when Greenwood is being asked by Dorothy Seckler at the Archives of American Art about Noguchi's work at the Market building, Seckler says, and was he working along the same lines as the rest of you then? The same kind of more or less political, symbolic, ... And Greenwood sort of seems to sort of almost interrupting. Yes, we were all doing, I don't know how else to say it. We were all doing propaganda. And certainly Noguchi tended to acknowledge this. Again, from this manuscript, he says, since the government was presumably based on the success of a revolution, our work had likewise to conform. While Diego Rivera did not contribute murals to the decoration of the market walls, he's of course hugely, he's an important influence. Noguchi remembers that he provided Rivera with a small painted plan for the walls, which has really unfortunately disappeared. So we don't know if and how Noguchi's designs evolved as he worked. In terms of the actual sculpting process, we know that Noguchi designed or sketched his design onto the three walls. From there, basically, it seems he built up the structure with a layer of brick, over which he added a layer of concrete filler. The final surface is a smooth layer of pigmented cement. I think this shot really sort of captures the volume of the piece. Here's another showing the same sort of thing, just how high the relief is of this thing is quite amazing. Now, as Noguchi described the actual process, I started to carve and build with an axe while molding the surface with stucco and marble chips. This I finished by trowel with sand, cement, lime mixed with color, a laborious process. And the Greenwood sisters, of course, are still working on their mural and they're watching this process. Greenwood recalls, quote, he hacked out with an axe or built up brick in, he built up a big relief, half sculpture, half painting, and then covered that with fresco paint. Greenwood makes an interesting observation here as we see throughout his career. Noguchi frequently innovates in the way he uses his materials and how he combines these materials with his techniques. And here the use of cement, which is, you know, even though I know it's the Romans are using it, the 20th century sort of claims it. So it's a very modern material here combined in the ancient art of fresco painting and ultimately creating a very distinctly, you know, Noguchi, a complicated hybrid between modern sculpture and fresco wall painting. Now I've touched on a few of the many places that Noguchi borrows or at least refers to the general and specific symbolism and themes of Mexican muralism, many of which would have been visible to him in the other murals at the Mercado while he's working on History Mexico. Here we have Pablo Higgins' ceiling. The swastika symbol appears in many other murals here and also in Marion Greenwood's own composition, which is directly across the room from History Mexico. Noguchi's interpretation of these symbols, however, here they become more like references to evoke international events rather than any specific episode or theme in Mexican history or in the Mexican Revolution. They are always more generalized and put into an international context. Noguchi's swastika hovers over a marching army of distinctly European and modern European soldiers. Posada's skeleton in a death struggle with the capitalist. Noguchi tells us that the capitalist is very specifically American banker J.P. Morgan. I'm going to just mention here that one of the things that details that is not visible, and unfortunately I don't have a photo of it with me, is that the Noguchi is very careful to actually incorporate the interior surround of the window so that the foot actually is incised right into the window, giving it an extra dimensionality that's really interesting and otherwise completely unnecessary, but it's a wonderful detail. And just to sort of show another detail that is easy to miss, the skeleton is actually holding a spike and doesn't always appear in photographs, so I thought I'd show that to you. The mural is filled with these wonderful little moments. And I really, if you ever get the chance to see it, you'll want to focus on them. So the setting is also, speaking of the context, is also very distinctly New York, Wall Street, complete with the Trinity Church and the Stock Exchange building. Note the bags of money that are appearing at the bottom, ready to be used as cannonballs. Now, the arm of capitalism wielding the whip, which drives the military-industrial complex. Now, remember, of course, the Mexican economy at this time is largely agrarian. So this is more of a reference to the international industrial complex that was then feeding the tide of rising European fascism. And of course, the fallen cross. Now, just note the prone figure, the white prone figure, which is probably a corpse. Its head is covered by a book, probably the Bible, and obviously recalling Noguchi's unrealized sculpture for justice, or the symbolism that he used in that sculpture for the Newark courthouse just less than 3 or 4 months earlier. And the fallen cross, of course, crushing humanity, which we saw in Orozco's murals in Dartmouth. And the eventual defeat of fascism and the rescue of humanity through the strength of a united labor under the international symbol of the red banner or flag. And I did want to draw your attention. It's more visible in this one. If you look above the cross, you'll see the head of a bull and the outstretched arms of a figure as if he's a matador. And of course, that makes that red banner also work not just as the international symbol of labor or the labor movement, certainly the Russian labor movement, communist labor movement, but also works as a toreador's cape. Ultimately, history of Mexico, of course, therefore has less to do with Mexican muralism and much more to do with Noguchi's own artistic interests and his awareness of the currents of contemporary American and European history and recent events, free of the galleries, free of critics, free of the WPA, free of the demands of portrait clients and suiting any client. Noguchi was finally able to give full expression in this mural, in this moment, full expression to many of his ideas. I'm just going to make a few other distinctions, of course. The most obvious difference from the other murals in the Market building, History of Mexico, is a sculptural relief and a very high sculptural relief, and the only such mural in the entire building. Now, while most of the murals at the Mercado take advantage of the fact that a lot of the spaces there are 2 stories high, Noguchi responds to his assigned walls by squeezing his mural into a relatively narrow 8-foot high band, which appears to actually almost bulge under the pressure of the ceiling, thus heightening the tension of the action of the first sections. And this is important because unlike so many of the murals in the rest of the building, which could be lifted out of their context and still work as works of art and still make sense, History of Mexico is very much a direct reaction to this particular space in the Market. Here we see the handle of the whip in the hand of the capitalist. It actually extends into the space of the ceiling rafters, right out of the mural. And also, unlike the vivid coloration of many of the murals in the Mercado building, Noguchi restrains his palette mostly to black, white, and red, and uses the contrast between these colors to heighten our sense of the 3-dimensionality of the relief, as well as the drama of the action. His singular ability, Noguchi's singular ability to respond to a given space and to mold that space to the needs of, well, his own needs and the needs of his artwork, can be seen in his clever use of the existing architectural details of this very room. He uses the 2 pilasters from the building's own architecture on either side of the room to frame the action, almost as if these pilasters or pilasters are curtains drawn back to reveal a stage performance. We remember that Noguchi had only that year started creating his first set designs for Martha Graham. Some of the positioning of the figures has actually been read by scholars as suggesting dance positions and poses that he might have witnessed through working with Graham. Reflecting Noguchi's understanding of evolving contemporary global political trends and conflicts, the action in the mural progresses from the darkness of the right to the relative lightness of the left. The triumph of labor ushers in a period of peace and prosperity. The final sections or passages of the mural on the left, in contrast to the turbulence of the scenes of the right, are noticeably calmer. They're rendered in low relief and muted colors. Here we see one of the recurring themes of Noguchi's work, his interest in science, represented in the three fields of scientific inquiry: chemistry, biology, and physics. And of course, we'll see some of these images again in Noguchi's work. The beaker and test tube, for instance, recur in the composition for his designs for the medical frieze for the 1939 World's Fair. And I'll be discussing that in the next talk. These particular shapes, these sort of amoeba forms, suggest Noguchi's awareness of international art trends, organic surrealism, for instance. The middle of the three shapes, for me, and this might be a stretch, but it does recall a sort of positive reverse of the design for the von Sternberg pool. And of course, the ultimate symbol of biology, a very vivid image of birth. This is over the left window of the room and balances the image of death over the right window. And of course, the last scene, the Indian boy, is reminiscent in form to Noguchi's earlier Black Boy, which was in George Gershwin's collection. The form is basically a chorus, which is of course a theme that he'll return to in the 1940s, famously the one in the Met. Here the boy considers Einstein's formula for energy. The entire final scene at this point suggests Noguchi's own faith in science to lead man out of the chaos of war. And this is an image that's got a special poignancy when we consider that some 10 years later, the atom would be harnessed into a tool of war and mass death and destruction. So as I say, I think I barely scratched the surface of all the meanings and possible interpretations, which I think Noguchi deliberately leaves us in the composition of History Mexico. One interesting insight that he does leave us for this work that I wanted to share is in the original title of the work, which was, quote, "History as Seen from Mexico in 1936," end of quote. Now, in subsequent mentions of the work, the title changes, of course, and by the time Noguchi is writing his autobiography in '67, the title is most definitely History Mexico. But even here, Noguchi explains that it was, quote, "history as I saw it at that time from Mexico," end of quote. So while History Mexico is always, of course, associated with Mexican muralism and with a particular moment in Mexican history, it's clear that even at this moment in 1936, Noguchi had a larger global view of the themes at work in his mural. And as James Ola's remarks, the title highlights a very sophisticated view, especially for the mid-30s, that history is always determined by the context. And as with so much of Noguchi's art, he does make it look very easy. And as a result, I think History Mexico is generally and very unfairly underestimated. It really is a tour de force in sculpture. It's hard to imagine any other artist of this time with the skills, with the intellect, with the physical abilities to wrestle such an amazing work in concrete and cement into this wall or any wall anywhere. Well, thank you very much. We'll end there. Very interested in any questions that have accumulated. And of course, please, if you don't have questions, we'd love to hear if you've actually had a chance to see the mural in person and what that was, what that experience was like.
Alex, thanks so much for that great talk, and thank you all for joining. It looks like we have a few questions accumulating in the chat, and I can read those out loud. And if anyone has other questions, please feel free to write them in, or you can just unmute yourself and ask. I wanted to kick it off with one question. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about your experience actually going, and if it surprised you in any ways, if it was what you thought it would be from the photographs, just your general impressions of visiting it in person.
Oh, absolutely. And I sort of, I talk about that in this presentation. I completely get why this work is sort of underappreciated. You kind of, even I have to say the Greenwood sisters murals are absolutely amazing. And it's the last thing you expect when you're sort of shuffling through these aisles of, delicious looking fresh food and vegetables and the crowds, and you go into this stairwell, which is a little intimidating. A lot of you have been will probably remember that. It's a dark space that you enter, and all of a sudden it opens up into this shock and awe mural by Marion Greenwood. And then just as you're sort of getting your head around what you're seeing there, you're at the top of the stairs and the world opens up to you. It's really just amazing. It was a lot of work trying to get those photographs. I'm really glad we did it. I think they turned out really well, but even so, it's almost impossible to get a photograph that really conveys the full impression of what it's like to be standing in front of this work.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to hopefully going at some point. Okay, so it looks like we got this question from the audience. It says, I think you mentioned that Noguchi felt frustrations about the usefulness of public art projects. Can you please share some public art projects that Noguchi felt were successful?
Public art projects in the 1930s. At this point, I think Noguchi thought all of his were useful and deserving to be realized. What I don't think he ever seems to get, and maybe this isn't quite the answer that the viewer is asking for, but I don't think he ever seems to get that when he walks into the WPA offices and some of the New York City offices with these plans for, basically let's take 5 New York City blocks and turn them into a playground 20 stories high. It's quite amazing that it makes perfect sense. It's very clear that it makes perfect sense in his mind at that moment. So what other projects he would have thought were viable? It is interesting that he's drawn to Mexican muralism because Orozco is famous for having said that murals, Mexican, and obviously he meant Mexican murals, were the highest form of art because they couldn't be commodified. You couldn't buy them and hide them. One rich person couldn't own a mural that they belonged to the public space. And that's sort of what I think happens with the history of Mexico. There's no way of dismantling that thing. It will always have to be there. The building has to survive so that the mural survives. And that is at its core exactly what Orozco is talking about. It can't ever be commodified. It always will belong to the public that walks by it and that gets to enjoy it in that room.
That's great.
And please, if I didn't answer that question properly, please feel free to re-ask it.
I'm seeing a lot of comments of some people have gone and lots of people are just excited about everything you've shared. I'm looking through for more questions. Oh, how can I more? Oh, sorry, people are talking to each other.
As they should.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, okay. In November 1935, Gershwin went to Mexico in the wake of poor reception of Porgy and Bess. He attended a dinner with Noguchi Rivero, Covarrubias, and Siqueiros. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. Finding the mural at the Mercado was an adventure in itself. A big question is what might have happened if Isamu and Frida weren't caught.
Yes, yes,
That is,
yes. It's all actually. I forgot about the Gershwin connection. Thank you very much for that. That's helpful because it's hard for us now to imagine Mexico City as the destination for the intelligentsia for this very brief period. The story of Frida Kahlo is very interesting to me because my work at the CR is so focused on objects, on the actual objects that result from Noguchi's artistic practice, obviously. And there's no portrait of Frida Kahlo, which I think is super interesting of all the other portraits. And that's a big part of his artistic practice at this moment. Of all people, that Frida Kahlo, it isn't the subject of one of his portraits, is very interesting. But what we have discovered is a part of the expatriate New York or American expatriates in Mexico City that do sponsor Noguchi to make portraits. Because he doesn't get sufficiently paid for the mural, he needs to take on these portrait commissions. And these people are absolutely fascinating in and of themselves. We were looking for these these portraits for years and years and years, and we found them in the last couple of years. The whole story is really interesting behind them. The daughter of one of the portrait sitters is in Mexico City only because her parents have given her the option of either staying in New York and working. They're very well to do. If she stays in New York, she has to work. If she's coming to Mexico City, she doesn't have to work. So they're really afraid of leaving her alone in New York City. So she comes to New York and comes to Mexico City with them. And she's very clearly part of all of these artistic circles. And one of the things she does, her parents are so afraid that she's going to run amok in New York. The first thing she does when she gets to Mexico is train as Mexico's first female bullfighter. And the parents don't know until they actually visit her in the hospital. She's been gored by one of the bulls. So all those people are a fascinating sub-story to all of this. And it really adds this sort of interesting flavor. I know, I'm totally on board with how really interesting this relationship with Frida Kahlo is. The letters that are in our archives are lovely. They're also in Frida Kahlo's archives between Noguchi and Kahlo. They're just poetry. But there's so many other stories going on there. And I think still a lot for us to learn about the texture of this moment that produces History Mexico.
That's all so interesting. I just want to ask if anyone has a question that I missed, if you want to just unmute yourself and ask, or if anything else, but it's good to see you all connecting in the chat as well.
Any connection these days is nice. Right?
Yeah.
I'm also isolated.
All right, well, I'm not seeing anything else coming in, but I just want to thank you again, Alex, and thank you all for joining. Oh, maybe someone was about to unmute themselves. Please go ahead.
Hi, Alex, I would love to learn more about the Martha Graham connection. I wasn't aware of any set work from him. If that's something you can share with us, that would be great.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a huge and long story of collaboration. A lot of it's one of the most famous collaborations between dancer and artist of the 20th century. 1935 is the first one. I don't know if I have a photo of it. It's the most simple set you've ever seen. Forgive me as I page forward here. I might have. Here, by the way, is the lady bullfighter on the far left. These are some of the. Here they are mixing with the Rockefellers. No, sorry, I think I initially did have a photo it's Frontier. And what he does for that dance number, it's the first collaboration. It's just a simple piece of rope that goes up and down. I'll send you a photo. I'll send you a photo later, Ruth. You'll enjoy this. So one of the most abstract and simple stagings, and very, very famous. And Noguchi's sister was actually a dancer with the Martha Graham dancers. So this is a deep, long-lasting collaboration right to his death. A lot of her costumes, some of the costumes are actually designed by Noguchi. Some of the jewelry is designed by Noguchi. And we have a lot of those in the museum's collection. A lot of them are still with the Martha Graham Trust. Huge area of research.
Right, thank you.
Oh, of course. Nice to see you.
I'm seeing one more question in the chat. Sorry, I missed this the first time. It says, as a half Irish American, half Japanese sculptor, Noguchi's identity was caught in the cultural divide between East and West. How do you think this complex hybrid identity manifested itself in his social activism and throughout his work, possibly in the History of Mexico mural? That's a big question.
Huge. And we should touch on it though, because Noguchi is the ultimate outsider, right? And here he is, even out of the US, not in Japan. He's in Mexico City, and he manages to fit right in. That's probably one of the, in my research, because I do so much research on the early works, the 20s and 30s, most of which are portraits. He worked, most of the later part of his career to distance himself from these portraits. He never wanted to admit that, in fact, he was a society portraitist for years there. And the image of Noguchi later on in life as a sort of wizened stone whisperer working in Japan, that's really at odds with the Noguchi we know of the 20s and 30s. He's the ultimate self-promoter, not in any kind of unpleasant way. He just really is genuinely social. He's always surrounded by some of the most interesting people, and that's why the Lady Bullfighter and Frida Kahlo and all these sort of people, even the ones that don't become famous, when you read about their background in this time, you realize he was surrounded by some of the most interesting people of his time, all the time. And he's almost always about 6 degrees of separation from almost every important figure of the 20th century, and certainly, and even now, the early 21st century. But he is the ultimate outsider, and I do think that that's the thing about History of Mexico. It is observing the world from an interesting distance, don't you think? He's looking at the world in theory from Mexico, from this moment in 1936, but it translates. If that was in New York, it would, ostensibly in many ways make perfect sense as well.
Great. Okay, we have one more in here. Someone said, I think you mentioned Albers in Mexico. Did he and Noguchi overlap?
Yeah, I've been trying to figure that out. There's a wonderful catalog on just on Albers' visit to Mexico during this period, and I haven't got the exact dates to see if there could have been possibly an overlap. But you've hit on a really interesting point that we don't have full archives, a full breakdown of this. And when you read this this manuscript that I keep talking about, it's this list of associations, like just a stream of consciousness. And I always wonder if I had him in front of me and said, "Oh, and by the way, did you meet Albers?" "Oh, yeah, I met Albers too, and we had multiple dinners," and there'd be these wonderful anecdotes. So a lot of what the work we're doing is trying to restore and make these connections. Not all of them are Frida Kahlo or Joseph Albers, but they're some of the leading and important figures of his time. And that the Lady Bullfighter, again, whose name I keep, it's gone right out of my head. Her father was a super important industrialist, and he's actually famous for having broken a union in Arizona. It's a very famous incident. And he's in Mexico City, sort of maintaining his interest in the Mexican rail system, which is, don't forget, all of those industries are just about to be nationalized. So you also have this history of Mexico is very much about a moment that's about to end even in Mexico. There's mention of the oil, in the far left, you can see some oil derricks. The oil industry is a year and a half, 2 years from being nationalized. So a lot of this mural is very much about, and I think Noguchi is very clear about that, certainly later in his life, it is a moment, it is a snapshot view from a certain moment, from a certain place and time.
That's really great. Thank you, Alex. I'm not seeing any other immediate questions, but again, if anyone else wants to unmute, I'm sorry if I missed anything.
Well, thanks, everybody. This was a lot of fun for me. It doesn't sound like anybody's actually been to see the mural, which is interesting. It's a even more reason for the work we're doing.
It seems like a few people mentioned seeing it in the chat, but okay. Yes. Good. Yeah, which is exciting. Great. Well, thank you again, everyone. And thank you, Alex. And we hope you'll join us for Alex's next talk as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
It's the World's Fair. The World's Fair in a couple of weeks. So
great.
Sign me up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.